Welcome you to this session, and I will actually start with one promise. You will not fall asleep after lunch, because I know we have a great panel. We have actually 7 people, which sounds like a lot, but we have 4 people as a first round to warm you up, and then we have 3 more to kind of get other aspects into our debate. But before we start debating the issue of trade and investment and its impact on development, let me just tell you about the technical procedures, and I have to read it. We have this assembly on Twitter. You may know about it already when you attended some of the sessions of this morning. You can connect to assembly over the OECD app. I was told it was shown, instructions will be shown on the scene in a second. So please feel free to give us your comments. You can also send in questions. I may not be able to take all of them. As you know, time is the only resource that I have no power about, but I'll try to take some of them. So send in questions, send in comments. So far, the rules of the game. And now let's start. We are going to talk about trade and investment. And when we were preparing this session, actually somebody said, so we're going to talk about everything about peace. And maybe this is somehow true. We're going to talk about everything because in times of globalization, everything is linked to everything. What I would like to do is to start with a view from New Zealand. Tim, you have been working on trade, I think, forever. Ever since you left kindergarten, you have been working on trade somehow. Help us, just think back for just a second. 20 years ago, what has changed? And don't give us a 20-minute story, just one thing.
Well, Petra, ladies and gentlemen, I would say that stepping back from some very real concerns that we have in terms of the aftermath of the GFC, the huge difficulty still before us in Geneva in trying to get some return on that. Rather intriguing, I'm being diplomatic, debates both in Europe on TTIP and in the United States Congress over TPA. If you step back and take a helicopter view, actually we've made tremendous progress. I mean, putting, as I say, some current problems to the side, just look at it in terms of some macro stats. Since 1980, world trade has grown, I think, roughly twice as fast as world GDP. Right now, it's around about consistent with global GDP, although the OECD is forecasting it to get to 5.1% by 2016. So from a long-term perspective, there's been this massive expansion of trade. From a long-term perspective, there's been an even more impressive growth in the total stock of FDI. And the figure I have in my mind is that in the early 90s, the total stock of FDI to global GDP was 10%. It's now over 30%. So, putting all the current difficulties, Petra, to one side, we've made enormous progress in expanding economic and investment integration. In spite of all the controversies around trade agreements, we are advancing the frontier of integration in a variety of different modalities. And we are in the process not only of lifting millions of people out of poverty. It's inconceivable to me, for example, if you take Korea as an example, that they could have achieved what they've achieved for their people without access to the international trade system. So it's basically a positive response.
We journalists rather like problems more than advantages and successes. Let's talk about the problems, though, about the in spite. When I look at the world, I don't look at the WTO anymore. I look into TTIP, I write about TPP. How does this look like from New Zealand? Does the world look more and more like a puzzle?
Well, being a small economy, we're the 52nd largest economy in the world. Which means, by the way, there are 150 economies smaller than New Zealand. So, small but not trivial is how I like to think both of myself and my country. Well, the world looks a mass with opportunities. We still, of course, having put in, not that we're the only country, but a huge effort politically and emotionally into the GATT and the WTO, are very unhappy about the state of affairs there. And there are certain problems that I know Arantxa and others would agree with me on this, because we've talked about this many times, that will only ever be resolved at the multilateral level, such as subsidies, all forms of contingency protection. But when we look at opportunities in terms of being a small, but not trivial, economy in the Asia Pacific, we've awash with opportunities, and we have used FTAs extremely creatively, not because that was our preferred choice, but because they were available, and we took opportunities where they arose, and we are very optimistic about our future as a result.
It was a rather diplomatic answer, wasn't it? If you had the power to get away with the FTAs, would you do so?
Oh no, if I had the power to rewrite history,
Oh, wow.
and global domination is my personal goal, I would have said the world would have been much better if we had had a pure multilateral system, if we had never put a qualifier into Article 1 and started from 1947 on that basis. But you can't rewrite that. And the so-called exceptions of Article 24 and the provision in the GATS that corresponds to that, plus other exceptions have driven us down a multivariant track. It's not been in any sense a disaster. It's actually advanced things, but it's not the first best way of doing it.
But it's a little bit like talking about good old times and talking about a free trade world.
Well, I would go for complete free trade. I mean, to me, I've actually got a wonderful quote, if you'll bear with me reading it out, but it does come from the OECD, it's holy OECD gospel, okay? This is, when I look at the continuing debate over free trade, I go back to a study that the OECD coordinated in 2011 with the WTO, and you were probably involved in that yourself at that point. Elle a tout oublié, malheureusement.
I'll ask you later.
And the World Bank, the ILO, and UNCTAD. And it is probably the most comprehensive survey of the evidence on the question that you put. And its conclusion, slightly ironic, which is very unusual for an international organization to use ironic humor, was the following. I've written it down. Quote, "Despite all the debate about whether openness on trade contributes to growth, if the issue were truly one warranting nothing but agnosticism, we should expect at least some of the many estimates that we have studied to be negative. The uniformly positive estimates suggest that the relevant terms of the debate by now should be about the size of the positive influence from trade, rather than whether increased levels of trade relative to GDP have a positive effect on productivity and growth." So, but we're still debating this in our political communities, and I guess we always will.
Why? What went wrong? Why is there still a need to debate it, even though you say most of the numbers are...
Look, I studied, like other people in this room, I'm sure, Ricardo Hume, which was written 200 years ago. But the reasons why people do not still accept the overwhelming theoretical base for this, the overwhelming empirical base that I've just quoted, what is probably the world's most ever comprehensive study of this, is a combination of ignorance, rent-seeking behavior from protected lobbies, and the fear of the unknown. So, in every trade negotiation, any one of us who've been involved in it understands this. You can never predict with great certainty companies that don't exist, that will be created as a consequence of greater openness. But the losers can identify themselves immediately. And rien n'a changé au fil des années. Nothing has changed in the course of the years. That's why we're still debating it.
Let me ask you one final question before I move over to the other side. Trade is slowing down. If you had one golden bullet, what would it be to kind of increase, to get it growing again?
Oh, greater macroeconomic progress and growth. That would be the one silver bullet you'd want. I mean, when you look at the situation, for example, with investment flows into Europe, I mean, they have declined dramatically. In the background document for this meeting, they say that the 2007 FTA inflows into Europe, which is associated with trade, were around about 210 billion in 2013. The pre-crisis level in 2007 was 868 billion. So the number one thing to stimulate both trade and investment is to stabilize the macroeconomic environment further and get some growth back into our economies.
Investment is actually the key word to move over to the other side. Tress Johnson, you are the managing director for global affairs of Citigroup, executive board member. Is it trade that is making the world move, or is it investment?
Making the world move. Well, I think it's both. I think we've, as the ambassador is rightly pointing out, we've look at the world as it exists today by virtue of the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, the World Trade Organization, all these bilateral investment treaties that now exist. And imagine what the world would be like without that, for starters. But I think we've hit a point now in the evolution of the globalization of the economy where we have to start paying more attention to adaptation, to the success that the ambassador rightly points out now is existing. I mean, we're in a huge debate about things back in Washington about the Trade Promotion Authority legislation. Of course, the benefits of the TPP have yet to be determined. That agreement has to be finalized. But when you look at the nature of a trade agreement today, and really it's most appropriate, and I constantly harp in Washington about this, it's trade and investment. It's no longer just trade. When you look at trade agreements and how they've evolved, of course, 25 years ago, 30 years ago, it was all about a tariff rate. And as the ambassador rightly points out, tariffs now are not the big issue. The big issue, I think, you asked for this sort of magic answer to all, from a perspective that I've got, and it's mostly drawn not from my experience with Citibank, but practicing international law in Washington and international trade law in Washington for 35 years. It's now the challenge of behind the border. The tariffs are there, and sure, we've got to deal with tariffs still, but it's these behind the border restraints on investment and the ability of a company to move from one jurisdiction into another and then not suffer discrimination, and to be able to operate on a par with the local national competition is what it's really now about. And I think that one of the things that we're wrestling with as we go to negotiate these trade agreements and these investment agreements is in getting it right and understanding that we are working in a cross-border world when it comes to business. And therefore, we've got to reach, and you see this in a lot of the materials that we are looking at for these sessions in the next couple of days, it's regulatory coherence. Right now, following the financial crisis, following the downturn in the business cycle, everyone ran for the hills. And notwithstanding the G20 commitments to stand still on protectionism, in fact, they said it, they put it in their declarations, and then each government went home and did whatever they thought they could to ring fence their economy and protect themselves. You know, it's manifest in the regulatory environment where the cost of doing business today is so incrementally higher than it was 10 years ago merely because of compliance. And I think this point blends into one of the things that's a very big theme of these conferences, and that is the impact on small and medium-sized enterprise. It's one thing for a city to comply with these rules. We've got a lot of depth and a lot of resources to do that. But when you look at a small or medium-sized enterprise having to comply with the anti-money laundering standards or the sanctions that now are being applied by governments for political reasons, just to name a few, that is crushing.
Before we go more into the detail and the question, what are really the problems for companies to use trade better? Let's stick for a second with the question that came up that I actually wanted to ask later on. The question, I think we could also pose it at this point already, isn't one of the reasons why trade is still disputed, and investment as well, the question whether we haven't really thought enough about whether it really helps development? Have we thought about that there are winners and losers, or would you actually basically say the more investment, the better, the more trade, the better?
I would disagree with you. I think that in my experience anyway, particularly in dealing with trade agreements, we are constantly doing, in trade promotion authority legislation in the United States anyway, we are constantly looking at the impact assessment of entering into a trade agreement. So for example, before we enter into the trade Trans-Pacific Partnership Agreement or the TTIP or any of these other agreements that are currently pending, we're still going to have an impact assessment done by the International Trade Commission on what that means for the U.S. economy. I think, no, I would say that the benefits of trade, as the ambassador points out, that became very clear to sovereign states, hell, all the way back to when the Dutch invented most favored nations. They knew what they were going to get from that, and it certainly paid off.
Let me ask you the question as well, Tim. Have you really taken into consideration enough the question of winner and losers when you did trade agreements, when you tried to increase trade?
Well, to use an old metaphor, the world can be combined into two different groups of people. Those who were around when electricity was invented who would have welcomed it, and those who would have been terrified about the impact on candle makers. So you've got to decide which side you're on. So yes, the candle makers were losers as a result of Franklin's invention, and you know the rest of history. So I'm sorry, we need adjustment assistance to look after this within our own national governments. We need to have a clear focus on providing our people with the skills necessary for them to compete in a global economy. But it is, in my view, as a convinced open trader, complete madness to focus on the losers as the reasons for not moving forward. I'm quite black and white on this.
Okay. Martin, you come from the Czech Republic, Deputy Minister of Foreign Affairs. You have also been working in trade issues for a long time. Would you agree with what you just heard? We in Europe, we would actually rather say we have tradition at looking into the question of winners, losers. Not that we have solved that at all, but...
Yeah. We joined, 20 years ago we joined the OECD, and it was much more simple for us because there was a big vision ahead of us to join the EU, to be members of the Western society after the communism in the Czech Republic. So, and it was a challenge for us to let's say, to go ahead. And, I think we are a successful story. I think that the trade investment is booming in the Czech Republic, and this is thanks to the trust that we are able to overcome all the challenges we are facing in the global world. There were doubts if the Czech Republic will survive in European economy just as a 10 million market, and what will be the unemployment, if we do have enough competitive products and services. And I think that the most important thing from the trade is that this is pushing you to change in the global context. And it's difficult to make a deal among all 28 EU member states, so we have a slightly more difficult policy-making position than New Zealand, because we have to make a consensus about the mandate for the European Council to have a deal with US. But I think that the trade and overlapping the barriers is something which is giving the health to the current life, and this is very much about the trust. If you ask which one important thing should help the global economy, I think it's to build a trust among the politicians and among the politicians and the people and the politicians. I think this is something which definitely could help to boost the economy.
Let's stick still for a moment with the questions of winners and losers. And if we don't look into one country and who's winning and losing within the country, but if we look into countries, we, the European Union, you come from the Czech Republic, I come from Germany, trying to create a bilateral trade agreement with the US. The US is trying to do it with other countries. Do we have to take into considerations countries that are then not part of these bilateral trade agreements and maybe losers?
There are 2 points. I think in liberalization of the trade, there are always losers. You have to change the structure of the economy. We are no more producers of textile industry. We have a nano sector in the Czech Republic, but the competition and competition is moving, pushing you to change. Otherwise, you will not survive. And the problem with free trade agreements is long and short-term perspectives of the deal. Because in short term, it's very painful for some sectors. In long term, it's moving us to change. And the same is with the countries. I think that what we need to take into consideration is to more think about the developing countries to have better access, not to be loser because we are protectionist, we have barriers, we are not allowing to bring agriculture products to Europe or some machinery products, raw materials, and I think that this is giving a disharmony in the world. So the losers maybe should be based on that I fail in the competition, but we should be fair in conditions for doing business and trade. This is how maybe to overcome these challenges with winners and losers.
Arantxa, what's your take to this issue? You've worked as the chief of staff to Lamy when you were still at the WTO. Now you're helping to facilitate trade for countries that don't have that easy access. You're the executive director of the International Trade Center. Feel countries excluded when they look towards Europe, towards the US, towards the big ones?
Well, there certainly is a bit of an angst out there over what the transatlantic trade and investment partnership will result into. There is a bit of a nervousness because what they hear is, not very clear at the moment. And I think one of the they are afraid of being shut out of the market, the big market that is being negotiated. They are afraid that the rules of world trade, of investment in the future will be negotiated bilaterally and not in a global setting, and therefore there is a bit of an angst. I would say that the best way to treat this angst is to get the narrative on the transatlantic agreement right. Now, I'm not here to offer advice on the narrative, but let's say that there are 4 things that I see in this agreement that are not properly explained to a global audience. One, the fact that the transatlantic trade and investment partnership in reality is the idea to create a big transatlantic market. So it's not just about trade and investment, it's more than that. It's a bit similar to what the EU did some years ago when it created the internal market in the EU. Second thing that I think needs to be clarified is that, and it would help probably also in Europe and in America, is that this is not about reducing the level of protection. This is about protecting consumers. That would be a reassuring message for consumers outside the EU and the US who also want to be protected, by the way. I mean, it's not that the rest of the world wants to have substandard products marketed in their economies. The third element that I think it's important to say is that this will be it will have an open architecture. An open architecture means that it will be done towards embracing others as opposed of saying it will be done towards excluding others. With these preconditions, I think a lot will be provided in terms of maybe reassurance that this is not going to result in excluding others from this huge transatlantic market.
You started by relating to fears. So fears are emotions, but some emotions, they are based on facts, others are not based on facts. Would you rather see it for African countries as an advantage if we had TTIP and TPP, or would it be a disadvantage? Or is it not? Is it too early to say?
Well, I guess the test of this is in what these agreements will have. What is going to be the content of these agreements? If the content of this agreement is to eliminate tariffs, that's great. You reduce tariffs, you eliminate tariffs, it's perfect, no problem. If these agreements that are being negotiated, TPP and so the Trans-Pacific Partnership and the Transatlantic Partnership, if the result of these 2 agreements is different regulatory frameworks, so different standards for car emissions, different standards for marketing cocoa and for marketing palm oil and for marketing, and the list goes on, then they get nervous because they don't know anymore which is the standard they have to relate to. And this is even more the case today for, frankly, 95% of the economic tissue of our economies, small and medium enterprises. 95, 96, 97% of the economic tissues of our economies. Multiplicity of regulation means not just a cost to them. It means the difference between being able to trade or being confined to a domestic market. So the test of all of this will be in when we open the box and we see what's in the box, and we see whether or not this is going to lead to fragmentation or it will lead to leveling the playing field, which is what business today is asking for. Big and small, more so small than big.
Atim, I see you're nodding all the time. Would you agree to what we just heard? Is something to add?
Yeah, absolutely. I agree with everything Arantxa said on this issue. I mean, I think fundamentally it is not going to make them worse off. Let's be clear about this. But the issue that Arantxa and used the example of regulatory frameworks is about how much better off they might be from having more integrated access into a system of North Atlantic and European economies that start to merge the same regulatory frameworks. And I actually think that the negotiators will have this in their mind. How much progress they make towards regulatory coherence has yet to be seen, because the negotiation has hardly started. In the context of TPP, we're much further advanced on regulatory coherence, and I don't think it's going to disadvantage developing countries. Apart from that, one should not forget that many countries, such as in my part of the world, Australia and New Zealand, we already grant duty-free, quota-free access to all LDCs, all Pacific Island countries that aren't LDCs. So, and a lot of the European countries have got advanced preferences for African countries. So it's not so much they're lacking in access opportunities. They are lacking, I think this draws out very well from Arantxa's comments, in the ability to make use of those opportunities. And that's both about an internal reform agenda, and it's about getting the right investment and the right regulatory frameworks in place in their own countries, as it is about getting access into Europe and the North American markets.
Martin, as you're the European on this panel, and in a way the European representative, would you agree to what Arantxa said? Did we get the message wrong somehow? Haven't we gotten it right yet? I'll ask the American as well.
Yeah. I have two points to mention. I think that I wouldn't blame the Trade Pacific, the EU-America deal for everything. I think that we have a problem that we are not able to achieve a global multilateral deal. That's the big problem, also for the prestige of WTO. And the more unsecure the world is, the more strong multinational institutions we need, including WTO. So my problem is that all bilateral duties or regional one are pushed by our delay in making global deals on the business. So that's the challenge, and we have to talk about the future of WTO. That's one point. And second one, I think that the danger for developing countries is that if we will really agree on the standards, and what is happening now, they have a GSP plus. They have a free access theoretically to developed countries, but they are not able to achieve our standards. The connectivity is the issue for the global world. And I need this responsibility through all kinds of assistance to help to develop these standards in developing countries, because this is a big barrier for them. And we are cynical. We are giving approach to our developed markets, but we know that they are not able to achieve the higher and higher standards. And this is not slightly too much fair policy, I would say.
Before I ask you, let me just very briefly ask Arantxa, this is your day-to-day business. Is it true that it's somehow getting more difficult to get trade into the developed world, into the European market, into the US market, because the regulations are getting more and more difficult, complicated?
I don't think this is a matter of EU and US versus the rest of the world. That's my first point. One of the virtues of the progress that has been achieved in the last 60 years is that this old paradigm that we had of one side, developed countries, EU-US, other side, the rest of the world, developing countries, more or less, has changed. And we are now into a world that I call, to borrow from a well-known film, and I hope I'm not going to be prosecuted for that, the 147 Shades of Grey. We have the membership of WTO take out the least developed countries that are quite homogeneous in terms of the difficulties they face, the challenges they face. The rest of the countries are 147 different shades of advancing and diverging in capacity, in ability, so it's not develop versus developing. It's whether or not you can today use the trade opportunities that you have. So it's translating these opportunities that should be a bigger part of our efforts once we have negotiated these trade agreements. Are these trade agreements really used by the companies? Big multinationals, let's not forget, 95% of them small, that are also to be the beneficiaries of these trade agreements. Jury's out.
Let's talk about an example. Let's take the medium-sized company from Ghana.
Yeah.
Is life easier today than 20 years ago? Can it, through trade, help to develop its country, or is it more difficult?
Let's say that we're living in a world where middle classes are enhancing, they are increasing, they're growing. And because middle classes are growing, they are demanding higher standards. Standards are not being imposed by, some sort of independent will out there. The standards are driven by consumers. The same way I don't want the milk that I drink and I don't want the jacket that I wear to be substandard, the Ghanaian middle class doesn't want that. The Kenyan middle class doesn't want that. The Chinese middle class doesn't want that. So this is putting a lot of pressure on small and medium enterprises in the north and in the south to meet those standards. Granted, in the south the problem is bigger because the ability of their local systems, their governments, their ecosystems to help them meet those standards is further away than in more advanced economies. So yes, it is becoming more difficult for SMEs to benefit from trade agreements, and yes, a big part of the answer is not in reducing those standards. Middle classes will not agree, middle classes will not accept that. It's helping these companies reach those standards. And of course, the more we multiply the standards, the more we multiply the problem. Hence, the importance of regulatory coherence in trade agreements. So it's a circle.
I'd like to point out, Annabelle Gonzalez and I were talking at lunch more or less about this, which is these trade agreements that we're looking at today are vastly different than what they were only 20 years ago. Look at TTIP, it's very fine-tuning about regulatory collaboration, cooperation. TPP, on the other hand, look at the disparate nature of the economies that are seeking to become, quote, partners in that context. Vietnam versus a New Zealand versus an Australia versus a US, and yet they're coming together. So, how do you make these things work is the question. I think what Annabelle and I were talking about is much more attention now today has to be paid to technical assistance follow-on. Far too many countries, at least in the US experience, will sign on to a free trade agreement and then think for some reason it'll magically make things better and their economy will grow. It's only the start, as our US Trade Representative's office very often points out to their counterparts. So technical assistance, I think, is really critical. I think the other thing that may be a segue for another topic is today's world is so digitally connected. One of the big topics for the conference is about global value chains. Well, global value chains ultimately rose out of the mist by virtue of technology, by virtue of information technology, the internet, digital communication. And today's world, in the context of trade agreements, investment agreements, how we interact as economies, if we don't get this digital element of trade and investment right, we're going to kill off something that is just having a huge impact globally, as we all know. And right now, unfortunately, that's one of those items where this regulatory coherence topic is running right into a brick wall on digital.
Can I just add my own observation to that? I think, first of all, as a matter of fact, the average growth rate of exports from East Asian and from a number of other emerging economies has vastly outperformed the global average. I think this goes to the heart of your 147 shades of grey. The point is that you cannot, therefore, from a statistic like that, saying that this is biased against all developing countries because a large group of developing countries have magnificently taken advantage of their opportunities in the last 25 years. This is not to make light of the problems that least developed countries have got, which are on a different scale at this stage of development. But in principle, my strong personal view is that it is becoming easier for all small and medium enterprises, whether they exist in advanced economies or large and small, or in developing countries, to start to participate more fully in the system. And it just seems to me intuitively obvious why that would be so. First of all, the point you've just made about digitization, which vastly reduces transaction costs of trying to deal with a supplier of an input in a global value chain who happens to live in Surabaya. I mean, it's much easier to deal with that than it was 30 years ago. In the past, a multinational corporation would just said, where is Surabaya? How many days does it take to get there? So, I think the digitization process by itself is one thing. I agree with the tweeted comment here down there that says in the context of TTIP, tariffs are hardly relevant, although it'll be very interesting to see when you get to certain agricultural tariffs whether the negotiators agree with that point. But broadly speaking, that is a correct comment, certainly true for NAMA, which is 90% of world trade. But the other thing that strikes me is that as the global value chain has evolved in such a powerful way, it is actually making it possible for countries that could never, for example, well, let me give you a concrete example. Could New Zealand produce an internationally sized industry that could compete with Boeing and Airbus? The answer to that is clearly impossible, literally impossible. But can we be part of their processes? Well, the answer isn't possibly. The answer is New Zealand has a company, it's not a large company, I think about 300 million US revenue, that produces the galleys, the cooking facilities, both for Boeing 787s and for Airbus 320s. So you can have a small economy, the last stop on the planet, which is how they describe New Zealand, participating in something that is incredibly sophisticated and is part of the construction of an international civil aviation superliner. So, really, I think I'm an optimist. I mean, I see the possibilities rather than the problems, while accepting that if you're in Lesotho, it's rather more difficult.
I think this crowd is a trade crowd, so probably most of them know what the global value chain means, but nevertheless, can anybody on this podium say it in 2 words? How has it changed? I mean, your example was really good, and somehow it is less important what you produce, that you have the end product, but that you can be part of the chain.
Well, I'll use the standard metaphor if you want a one-liner.
One line, it's good.
It is no longer made in the United States, but made in the world. That's the one-liner to describe the global value chain.
And how does investment fit into that? It's a difficult one.
Well, I think that what we're seeing through empirical analysis of global value chains thus far is that if you have a relatively nurturing investment climate within the host country, that the likelihood of your ability to participate in the global value chain is going to be far elevated. And indeed, when you look at, like Max Slaughter out of Dartmouth did a study a couple of years ago, sponsored by the U.S. Council for International Business, that it basically points out those countries that have a relatively liberal trade and investment climate are going to be more likely to participate in global value chains than otherwise. So I think it definitely is hand in glove.
And I saw you writing down something.
No, I wanted first of all to say that we are also supplying Airbus with the doors, the Czech Republic. So we are also incorporated in global value chains in that. So that's a good example. Now is a chance for that. So I think that the point is what is our added value in the value chain. So that's clear. So it's made in the world, and the competition among us is what will be our added value to final supplier, final producer, or we are lucky if we have a final manufacturer. That's great. So that's coming back with the essential thing, like how technically educated workforce in the country, what is the overall business climate in the country, and so the best export promotion is in fact competitive industry and competitive economy for that. So this is a new chance for people and companies, not only companies but also for the people to be successful in this global world. So that's about value chain. So, my point is that we have to all the time think if we are successful. We used to think in the Czech Republic what we will sell abroad. We were traditionally manufacturing industry. We were known as a producer of tractors and cars, and but now the issue is what are the challenges? What is the foresight for the economy, and what are the key technologies demanded in the global world?
It also means that economic departments have to think differently from the way they thought 20 years ago.
Definitely. What we are trying to do with the embassies is not to give us information about what is happening in the country. What are the trends? And this is a unique information for us, which we share with the businesses. And businesses are saying, yes, we have a cluster for that. We are able to go this way. And this is how to improve, by the way, the export services of the government, because we are focused. Otherwise, we should have 18 missions to Brazil. Brazil is nice. But if you don't know what we would like to offer or what you have in your portfolio, it is like traveling in the city without the map.
Arantxa?
I think the fragmentation of production, which is what value chain means, has provided exponential opportunities for, in particular, SMEs to be part of the global economy. And on this one, I fully agree with Tim. The glass is more than half full. The opportunities are exponentially growing. What we need is to make sure that they also exponentially translate into realities. And we have a great opportunity coming up in July when the UN family meets in Addis in the Financing for Development conference, which will be the preamble of adopting a new development agenda for the UN family in September, to make sure that economic development figures more prominently into the aid, so-called development agenda of the future. So we do a lot in education, in healthcare, we have to do a lot in peace and security and human rights, but we also have to do a lot in economic development. And on this one, it cannot work unless it is a concerted effort between governments with their ODA, official development aid, and the private sector with their knowledge of the markets, with the purchasing power, with their expertise. Blended together, we can make sure that we help translate these opportunities, which I agree are exponentially growing by the day.
I think nobody could have concluded this first round better than you did, actually, with these words. So what I would like to ask the panelists now is to quickly switch seats with those three gentlemen sitting in the first row and still stay in the room, and please shake your hands, wave your hands when you want to be included in the debate. So thank you for all the answers. There's still some questions open and left over, and I would like to ask one which actually came up on the screen as the second question again. Bas van Abel, you're the founder of Fairphone, and before I ask you the question, I have to give you the regards from my 14-year-old son, who never spent his pocket money. He always put it into the bank account, and then he spent almost all of it on the Fairphone. So apparently it's attractive
Fantastic.
at least to some young people. What you're trying to do is to make sure that the whole value, the whole chain is somehow economically, ecologically, and socially responsible.
Yeah, that would be I can't really say it's an end goal, because everything changes every time. You know, everything. You can talk about fairness 100 years ago, and it's different than what it's now. So it's an ongoing thing, and obviously we cannot, create world peace to create fair phones. But what our aim is to, and it goes back to adding value, the value chain. What is it exactly what we mean when we say it adds value? Does it mean, money, finances, growth? So what is growth? Is it sustainable growth? Is it social growth? Is it social impact? So what we're trying to do, and we're social enterprise, so we've been set up to actually, with our product, kind of surface that supply chain of electronics, which is super complicated. It's everywhere. And by doing that, by surfacing it, to find out, is it possible in all these elements we find to add social value, to add sustainable value, while maintaining a commercial model, because that's basically our sustainable model. We're in the economic system, but it's really about how we define these values, and I think that's the main question for me, and that's also the main question for Fairphone, how you can add that on a social environmental level.
You're actually trying to do it as a company. Would you say to those gentlemen more in the business of politics that they should also go more for those ideas? Should they include in trade agreements social clauses, environmental clauses, or would you say it's good that we as a business are doing this and that's enough?
I do think it takes more than just businesses to do these things. To give you an example on conflict minerals, and it's a very complicated thing. So on the one hand, I believe that open trade is very important, but on the other hand, you see that, and we're talking about losers. I think we've talked about consumers might be the losers of some of the open trade, but I do think also just people in general could be losers of something that you put in place where there's actually fragile states involved and a lot of wealth in terms of minerals, which you see in Eastern Congo and the Great Lake region. And the question is, do you want to do something about that in terms of legislation, or do you leave it up to the companies to actually solve that? I do not think that companies at this point in time are let's say, human enough, because companies haven't been set up to actually, act in a social way. It's not what they're meant to do to actually solve that. And in the end, it's people that can solve that. It's consumers that start asking the right questions and also asking about the right products. And companies will change then. But till that time, you also need legislation, I think, to solve some issues that we've got alienated from this much. People know there's people dying around the world because of all kinds of stuff, but it's too disconnected.
But couldn't one argue, Arantxa mentioned the middle class that actually wants standards, wants good stuff, that in a way with your successful business model this will develop just naturally? That people do care about the way products are made, and not just in their own country, but also in other countries?
If you're saying that it starts with consumers, I do think you have a very valid point. But the good thing is that we're all consumers, and in that sense, you don't have differences. You don't have developing states. You don't have undeveloped states. You don't have fragile states. You talk about people that buy things, and if everybody agrees as people that you buy things with the notion in mind that everything you make also destroys. On a more philosophical level, then that is something that can actually, change the economic system. And it still, it doesn't actually change the economic system. It's still the same open market and everything works the same way. It's just that the values you base your decisions on as companies and people are different than just purely profit or anything. I'm not saying that it's purely profit in this world. It just gets lost because of the alienated effect the value chain has on us. It's called value chain, but it's basically, we don't know anything about it as consumers. We've put those factories somewhere in Asia or in Europe. You won't find any factory. I just heard that even in Europe, the last electronics manufacturers are just leaving. And how can you take responsibility also as a consumer if you got alienated without becoming too Marxistic about it? If you got alienated from things you use, it's very hard to take responsibility of all these things. So that's and the internet and the digital world can actually, I do think the digital world can change that, because it does give transparency. It does show where things are coming from, and that's the beauty of it.
Annabel Gonzalez, you worked as a trade minister, and you work at the World Bank right now. When you listen to that, what's your reflection? Would you say that Bas is in a way overburdening politics and politicians when he asks for all these things that he just asked for?
I think the role of governments, and in that regard of international organizations such as the World Bank Group, is to put in place policies or support governments putting in place policies that foster trade and investment and that foster the possibility of small and medium-sized enterprises to connect to these trade flows, to connect to global value chains. From this perspective, standards are an important element that bring about certainty to consumers. They protect important values, but it is true that they sometimes producers particularly in developing countries, but also in other countries, can find it difficult to comply. It's because they're very expensive or they are complex standards. So one important role for governments is to put in place policies, again, to support developing the capabilities of these producers to comply with standards. And part of the role of an organization like the World Bank Group is precisely, again, to support governments in putting in place these public policies.
One of the things that I learned when I was still covering the WTO was that there was a certain divide among countries. So lots of the countries where standards weren't that high actually said, look, let's be slower with that one. We still are in development, so we don't want others to impose certain restrictions by the help of trade agreements. Is this debate still there?
Certainly, the debate is still there. Sometimes some of the standards are more complex than necessary. Frequently, producers are faced with having to comply with different sets of standards to protect the same value. So they have to go through 3, 4, 5, 6 certification processes. These processes are expensive. So this is to say that this is not a sort of a peaceful topic. Having said that, however, I think that it is also recognized, again, that standards protect important values and that it is actually an important driver of, it can be an important driver of productivity enhancements in a number of companies. Now, to me, the key is how can you facilitate compliance with standards, either through having more simple standards, through reducing the number of standards that apply to a particular industry product, and by strengthening the capabilities of producers to be able to comply with those standards, which may include technical assistance, but also access to finance and others.
But before you keep on writing, just give me a quick answer. The key question here is that from one point of view, standards are about protectionism. They're excluding people, trade, goods. In your point of view, standards are a way to increase value, well-being. How do you get those two things together?
I'm not necessarily saying that.
No? Okay.
But I mean, I'm saying that in some situations, it might be necessary to put standards in place or to do a proper due diligence on where things are coming from. And in my opinion, it's actually about transparency. You can put the danger with compliance, standards, rules is that that many of these things become checkbox exercises. That you, as a consumer, you can sleep at night because there's a fair trade label, there's a this label, there's a sustainability label, there's this label, that label, that. There are hundreds of labels. It's also very difficult to determine, what is valuable and what's not for me. So I do think there's also, it makes consumers lazy in a certain way. On the other hand, you see that there's problems in the supply chain. I gave the example of the conflict minerals, where you do need proper legislation to actually, to be able to change things in a way, or to push them towards a way that you actually prevent problems from happening as well. I mean, there's a war being fueled by the trade of minerals, which end up in our consumer products. Do you want that? So it's a bit more nuanced than saying I'm pro standards and it will solve the world. I do think there's a healthy combination of those two.
Let me switch to the other side. You're not producing in Myanmar, do you? You're not.
Sorry?
You're not getting any resources from Myanmar. I should have asked this
No,
question.
no. Well, I don't know, actually. A lot. It might be. You never know.
Okay.
There's hundreds and hundreds.
Imagine he would come to your country. would you be basically happy? Would you say, get away with your rules, with your regulations, with whatever you want from us? We as a country want other countries to open up their borders for trade, and that's all we want? Or how do you assess this issue?
Yes, for me, I have to say more than happy to accept such, the business in the country, because like a country of small economy like Myanmar, standard is kind of the difficulties to comply with, because compliance of the standard is a big the difficulties for Myanmar to access some the products to other markets. Let me give you an example. In 2012, EU has reinstated the GSP to Myanmar, but unfortunately, so far we cannot export huge amount of our products to the EU market as we expected because of the compliance with the standards. This is one of the challenges for us as well. But we all agree that we must comply with the standard, because this is very critical for international trade. And if we want to integrate our economy into the global one, we must comply with the standard. But still, there are a lot of challenges for us. Challenges meaning capacity challenges. And some cases, standards are really difficult so far for us. For example, for traceability, for the agricultural products. So is not possible for Myanmar for the time being, but we need to improve a lot for that.
You mean your agriculture sector is not yet so far that it could export to Europe, for example?
Exactly, yes, because of the some technical problem, and also some requirements like sanitary and phytosanitary, and also there are some of the technical barriers to trade are the key issues for us to access our products into the EU market.
If you're a minister in your country, but if you had more global power, what would you actually do to make trade a means to better help development of your country? If you had a wish, what would it be?
So the first thing I would do is to help develop the capacity of SMEs in the country, because SMEs are really,
you have a
yes, exactly. SMEs are really important for the country like the small economy like Myanmar, because for the time being our SMEs capacity is still very low. So the first thing I'm going to do definitely is to help develop the capacity of SME to have the integration into the global value chain. So this is the first thing I would do definitely for that.
What about the openness of markets? Do you feel that they are opening up? Are they open enough? Do they close? What's your view?
For me, both, because openness of the trade for the country like the Myanmar is, if you look at the situation of Myanmar last 5 years ago and compared to that of nowadays, so we can see a lot of significant improvement in the country because of the liberalization and open trade policy and investment, the policy, so that the open trade is to some extent really good for the country. We do need that, but still we have, as I explained before, we have a lot of challenges to deal with such open trade and investment because of these. Let me give you an example. When we revised our investment law in 2012, so our government's idea is to attract more FDI into the country for the economic development. But unfortunately, at that time, local business community, they are against the government's idea, to open up the more business into the country, because they thought at that time that the influx of FDI into the country is a collapse of their business. So they do want the government to protect more to them. So there are a lot of challenges, for us, and even though we understand the open trade is a necessity for the development of Myanmar.
Actually, Charles, at this point, I would really like to ask you again, because you have a kind of the overview of investment flows. What we just heard, is this really the biggest issue, that national companies, national business are still a bit critical when it comes to global investment? What are the barriers not to trade, but the barriers to investment? Actually, I thought there should be a microphone, but I just give you mine. Got one. Thank you.
the barriers to investment are multitudinous. I think your country in particular is suffering from, if you will, the legacy of the sanctions situation. I know in Washington we're still trying to get past some of the listings of individuals who may appear as sanctioned individuals. And as we know from our experience with Russia, with Iran, the United States has sort of a propensity to use economic sanctions to conduct its foreign policy. From a business perspective, that makes things very difficult. And the compliance issues for small and medium-sized companies to do business with a country like Myanmar right now by virtue of the sanctions is very, very difficult. So there are these regulatory burdens. I think he's made the case for why technical assistance is so critical, because I think your country is rich in a lot of different resources and capacities. But when you look at infrastructure, when you look at the rule of law, when you look at a lot of things that are typical on a checklist of due diligence to do business in a given country, there's got to be improvements, you know, and you know that, and I know that, and everybody who's looking at your market knows that. But you're getting there, you know, and then the trick is to keep trying and building that capacity until at some point you do engage.
What about the quality? Just in a second. What about the quality? Would you just keep the microphone just for a second? I would like to add another question, because what I feel is that we also have a growing debate of the quality of investment. Is this an issue that not all investment is good investment, but that countries tend to more and more decide what kind of investment they want? And is it a good sign, or would you basically argue, be free to whoever comes?
I'll answer that, but I think, why don't we ask Annabelle what she
Okay.
thinks of that one? I will answer it, but
Let me say there are different types of investments, as we know. They're natural resource seeking, market seeking, efficiency seeking, strategic assets seeking. And if you look in particular at investment aimed at efficiency seeking investment, this is the kind that is very relevant for global value chains. And global value chains are very important in the world today, as we know. And I think they are particularly important for development because global value chains allow small and medium-sized firms and developing countries and even low-income countries to participate in global trade in a way that was not possible before, because countries do not need to have a big industrial establishment or have all inputs within the country or have expertise in all areas. They can specialize in one task, in one part of the global value chain, and they can integrate into the global value chain. Now, in order to do that, having a sound business environment to be able to attract investment is key, because foreign direct investment is normally the driver of many of these global value chains. But it is important also to look at other measures that will facilitate the participation of the small and medium-sized enterprises. For instance, reducing trade costs. There are numerous studies out there that say that trade costs can be an even more important, a barrier that is even more important than tariffs, for example. Some studies at the World Bank, for example, show that countries that have difficulties at the ports may increase the cost of trading by 60%. So, this means, of course, infrastructure. But it's not only infrastructure. It's not only the roads, the ports, which are very important, but it's also the soft part of it, the logistics, the simplification of procedures, the border management, customs administration, transparency. Everything, for instance, that the Trade Facilitation Agreement, the WTO Trade Facilitation Agreement aims at doing. It's also important to look at enhancing the skills of the workforce. This is very relevant if you want to participate in value chains and if you want to upgrade in global value chains. So my answer to this is that, there may be instances where the investment may be controversial, or one may also argue that, it's more difficult for SMEs to integrate in global value chains, and probably all of that is true. But if you look at the way in which production works in the world today, not only manufacturing but actually in services, these global value chains, are a wonderful vehicle for multinational companies to come together with small and medium-sized companies to create value for the consumer, basically.
Okay, thank you.
and my answer is sort of simple. Of course not. Not all investment is good. And particularly, I think when you get down as you work with a company, for example,
there's a certain type of investment to make in a given market that makes sense, and then you can overdo it, at which point you have a failure. And if you have a failure, that haunts, the host government for years to come. I've seen this happen time and time again, where the bad news it just eclipses all the good news of good foreign direct investment. And it's that one bad example, that one bad experience that a company will have that goes viral in the foreign direct investment community. So you've got to be really careful, both as the government, the host government, in designing what it is that they're trying to lure in so that it's appropriate to the economy, it's appropriate to the infrastructure capacities, et cetera. As likewise for the company. The company doesn't want to go in there and dump $100 million into a failure. So it's got to be very carefully considered, and therefore I think the answer is pretty simple. No, not all investment's good investment.
Okay. Tim, I actually would like to get your impression to what we heard from Bas. Would you say it's a nice business case and leave me alone with it as a politician, or would you draw lessons from that?
No, I mean, I always think that these two worlds should live in symmetry, one with the other. So my job as a negotiator and as now a politician is to try and create those opportunities, and at home to support progressive legislation that establishes good working conditions, good environmental controls, and we should be entering into agreements that provide some symbiotic development along those lines. The TPP agreement will have separate chapters on environment, will have a separate chapter on labour, and it won't please the extremists, but it's sending a big political message to move in this direction. So that to me is the two worlds have to be approached, one and the other. One is not a substitute for the other.
And you would actually argue it's good that now modern trade agreements have those chapters about environment, about labor, or would you say it's just something that we have to do to kind of get them sold?
I don't think we should try to go into this at this time. It's an extremely deep and new issue around private standards in international trade, and there is some analytical work, but not a lot of negotiations taking place here. I just would like to say again, I think that I strongly agree with Rick's point. There's no such thing as a good investment per se. It's some investment can be extremely positive and others can be appalling. And it's up to the responsible authorities, both in terms of the company and in terms of the host government, to try and make sure it falls into the former, not the latter category, if I've got the direction right in my comment. I can think of many examples where quite exacting environmental or consumer standards were put in place that a well-meaning foreign investor can actually help that country. In fact, in the case of Myanmar, a New Zealander, Steve Marshall, who is in Yangon, representing the ILO, is working with your textile companies to try and help improve labor standards, improve safety, and actually, hopefully, in his small way and along with the efforts of your own people, could even create a strategic advantage for Myanmar in international textile and clothing exports. Because people like me who go into shops, we do care about these values. And if we have an assurance, which is a subject of a properly certified process that we think has got integrity, we don't mind paying a few more dollars for it. I mean, that's essentially, I think, consistent with your philosophical view.
Would you like to add something?
Yes, I fully agree with that. A couple of weeks ago, there was a group of the European apparel company. They visited to my office and they are asking a lot of questions to me, but I realized that their question more focused on the responsible business conduct. They asked me a lot of questions about the labor standard and also human rights and also environmental transparency and anti-corruption. A lot of questions they raised me, and at that time I realized that okay, the short answer for you, from me, is: do you want Myanmar to be, seriously getting involved in responsible business conduct in the value chain and supply chain? They say yes, we are doing that. Although we are a recently opened up economy, but we can understand that the responsible business conduct, which include a lot of criteria, is necessary for the country. and also learning lessons from the other countries' experience. Also, we have also had a very bad experience in the past because of some investment which are not made responsibly. So we are now focusing more on the responsible business. That must be, our the intention to create not only better business environment in the country, but also that investment must be responsible. Those are the considerations for the future of our country.
And let me be cynical just for the sake of the argument. You don't get then as an answer from companies, oh, get away with this stuff. Just be just be cheap with your labor. That's all we want.
Actually, yes, still if you compare to the labor, the price of Myanmar with other neighboring countries, our labor costs are still cheaper than that of other countries. So this is the one reason why there are a lot of investment in labor-intensive industry are now coming into the country. But our idea is not only to rely on the cheap labor for investment, but also all investment need to be compliant with the labor standard. So we want to make sure, because there are a lot of the unnecessary experience happen in our neighboring countries because of their lack of compliance with the labor standard. So this is what we are now making sure for that.
Annabelle, this question actually fits to what we're just discussing, and it's probably one for you. How can policymakers in developing countries negotiate the entry of multinationals in their country and at the same time avoid bad investment? Is Myanmar a showcase for how to do it?
I think Myanmar is making very important efforts in this area, and I'm proud to say that we are working with Mr. Oh and the government of Myanmar to reform the investment legislation in Myanmar, which is a very, very important project. Now, I think that when I was listening to our conversation here, I'm thinking most of the countries that I go to, and I go to many countries, all of them, the first question that they have for us is, how can I attract more investment into my country? They want to bring in not only the capital associated with that, they want to generate the jobs, but they know also that this is a way for them to have access to know-how, to the latest technologies, to innovation. So most countries are very keen on attracting investment, and they want to attract, if you wish, the right type of investment, because most governments, if not all governments, want the jobs, want the know-how, want the expertise. So our advice to them is attracting investment is not a question of just what is the cost of your labor. That's not the most important issue. You need to have a business environment that fosters the rule of law, that respects private property, that respects contracts. You need to work in terms of upscaling the skill sets of the population. If you have a population that is better educated, you will be able to attract companies that will bring more value to your country. You need to have, again, the right infrastructure, the right logistic systems in place. You need to reduce trade costs. There are a number of measures that you need to do. But I must say that, if you look at the past 25 years, investment flows have multiplied by about a factor of 8. Developing countries are increasingly investing abroad, and today they are recipients of over half of all of the FDI worldwide. So, and we hear some cases here and there, and they're very important, and we need to pay attention to that. And this is why standards can help. But we also need to hear about all the positive stories that foreign direct investment brings. And I can tell you, coming from Costa Rica, I was minister in charge of trade and investment in my country. This is a country that has transformed itself completely from producing 4 agricultural products, to trading over 3,500 different products, in part by connecting to global value chains.
Arantxa, would you like to add something? And while you're grabbing the microphone, could you also read the question? No, there was one before. Let me repeat it. The question was actually, does it help countries to have quotas on local content? Can countries like Myanmar do so? And would it help to attract investment, or would it rather push investors away?
This is a very tricky question. Of course, you have.
This is why you got it.
Yeah. You have a tension between trying to capture more value added in the country, wanting not just to be an exporter of commodities, but wanting to climb up the value chain and trying to do this by saying, well, I'm going to force you to localize here these activities, and through that, I'm going to be able to capture a higher part of the value. You also have companies that are very comfortable with this local content in that they get a bit of a captive market. In my view, this should not be seen with a short-term lens. This is a long-term lens. And maybe the answer, if you take a long-term lens, is not localization policies, but is more looking at the enabling factors that will allow you to do more value added in your country. You're not going to do more value added just simply by edicting that a greater part of the value added has to be done in the country if you don't have qualified labor, if you don't have institutions that are going to certify your products, if you don't have the infrastructure that is going to allow you to move up the value chain. So I will take on this, like on many other trade and investment related issues, I would rather take the long-term view and see trade and investment together with many other domestic policies, as opposed to short-term, so to speak, quick fixes that may end up harming more than helping.
Sounds like an almost impossible task to do all the things at the same time, and many difficult and costly things.
Ask Annabelle. Ask Annabelle. She can tell you her experience in Costa Rica. I mean, let's take a very concrete example. Instead of looking at the difficulties, let's look at how one does it.
No, I think that, the first thing probably is for a country to have a clear vision of what is it that they want to do. If they get that clear vision right, then there are indeed a number of measures, a number of actions that they need to take, and I refer to a number of them. Some of them are, of course, more difficult than others, but there is also two things I want to mention. One is the role of the international organizations, and I was talking before about, for instance, reducing trade costs. Well, the portfolio of the World Bank Group in the area of trade is $13.5 billion US, and half of it goes to projects on trade facilitation to help countries reduce the cost of trade. So there's an important part there. And the other part that I wanted to mention, which is very relevant, is the role of the private sector. I think that now that we're looking in terms of financing for development in the context of the conference in Addis Ababa, we have been talking at the World Bank Group about the need to move from billions to trillions, because official development assistance is about 150 billion US dollars. And the needs of the developing countries out there are much more than that. So how do you get from there to addressing all of these needs? It is through increased private sector participation. How can you unleash the power of the private sector to invest in infrastructure, to invest in logistics systems, to go to countries like Myanmar and other countries that need this investment to continue to provide the conditions that will, enable a better business environment, will sort of bring in a virtuous circle where more growth fuels more growth through the participation of the private sector.
Bas, you wanted to add something?
Oh yeah, no, I'm listening to all the arguments on this matter, and I do think the problem is a bit of a catch-22 situation. I mean, you're for growth, you need growth, right? And that is the problem with growth. That it's a self-fulfilling kind of monster that wants to go ahead, and it wants to go faster and faster. So how do you start? Where is that tipping point? And I do think the private sector, and not only the private sector within the boundaries of your country, but we're talking about the global value chain. It's standards are to get to the standards again. Standards are great to get to a point where you have a certain quality of your product, and the ILO standards are very important in that sense to actually meet that. But you can also say, how do we get there together? Yeah, so that's also a starting point. You can say, well, we only do business with you once you're there. Yeah, and you take care of that. You have to do a lot of investments, which you won't get because you're not there yet. But once you're there, we'll get to you. That's a catch-22, right? So the starting point could be, well, okay, let's do an entry point assessment on the situation here. You know, to be honest, Fairphone, in our supply chain, we know for sure that there's child labor. We know for sure. We work with Congo. We work in Congo, in Eastern Congo. It's conflict-free. That's a great step. We're not leaving the country. You know, we're working there for a reason. We're working there. We could have gone to Australia and mine our stuff there and say, you know, listen, the working conditions are fantastic, and everything is good. But we went to Congo because of the Dodd-Frank Act. A lot of companies are leaving. You know, they just leave the country behind because there's no, you know, it's just too complicated to mine, you know, to source in Congo. All this stuff. It forces the government to actually take care of their stuff, which is great, but it's a long-term solution. But on the short term, they need economic stability, because otherwise you'll end up in a conflict again. So the only thing you can do as a company, I think, or the right thing to do as a company, is to invest into creating a situation where you can actually address child labor and to get to that next step. And every step you make agreements on how to get to that next step, and not just run away because there's something happening which we all know that's happening. So, you know, companies are used to avoiding risk. That is the whole idea. And I do think it's time as a company as well to be able to put yourself in a more vulnerable position and use that position also to improve things instead of just saying, you know, this is how it should be and then jump in.
You may. Was the temptation to give you an applause, but it really didn't really work out. Maybe you should try again.
No, that was my point anyway. So.
Thank you. There's one question that kind of struck my mind, and I'm going to ask it as a final one, and I don't know who is going to answer it. Is there any relation between corruption and trade?
Well, let me say, I mean, corruption is a deterrent to investment. That comes up in every survey that we make. Corruption is a deterrent to investment, and in the world today, trade and investment are closely linked. So, you know, certainly corruption is no way to go if you want to participate in the global economy via trade and investment.
Thank you. That was a short answer, the very precise one. And we are coming down right at the right time. What I learned from this debate is that it gets more and more interesting the less we talk about the big things, the TPP and the TTIP and all these highly disputed ideological agreements, and when we really rather go down to earth and learn about the nitty-gritty things, about what Arantxa told us, what you said, what we learned from Myanmar. So I learned a couple of things. I found it interesting. I hope you did so too. I thank you for listening. I wish you a great afternoon, and I think the panel deserves an applause.